Okay, welcome. Really exciting to see all of you here. Today, Doug is going to be talking about the foundations of nutrition. And this is especially important because nutrition is the foundation of everything that we do here at the Hirsch Center and over here at Evolve. Doug has been an educator for many years. He's got his master's in education, and we're really excited to have him. He's relatively new to the practice, and the response has been really excellent. Having somebody who can just focus in on the dietary stuff, the meal planning, the nutrition, has been really helpful so that we can deal with some of the more complex issues, which is great. Point of order, we do have a bathroom right here, and you do have a walkway in case you need to use it. Please feel free. Do not hold. We are
and we don't have to step over heads either. I like that there's a walkway.
Indeed, yes. You can do it gracefully, or you can. And we are going to be videotaping, which will be up on the website, hopefully in the next day or so. And if you haven't had an opportunity to watch the one we did with Doug a couple weeks ago, that one's up there, Pitfalls of a Vegan Diet, which has a lot of good tidbits for everybody, not just vegans. We do have some recipes that are now online. If you go to the patient support tab, my wife Stacy has started putting up some recipes, and we're going to get some more resources from Doug and David and some other people in the clinic that will be up there too. And yeah, I think that I just want to express part of what we do here is we really focus on gratitude. So I would like to express some gratitude to all of you for being here, being part of this process, and definitely to Doug for our wonderful relationship.
Welcome, folks. Thanks for coming. I'm feeling gratitude you guys came here tonight instead of Dairy Queen. Good job. And you know, tonight I really the main theme of the talk tonight is really sort of a return to the earth, because really I think our food supply has kind of gone south. It's been messed with, unfortunately. You know, there's a big incentive for profit in our culture, and there's a lot of companies now that are making food for people without really the health of the people in mind, with the profit as what they're really thinking of. And so we have what you might call the foods of commerce. This is a term that Weston Price, a dentist, famous dentist in the 1920s, coined when he started to notice that cultures that got away from their indigenous diet and began to eat modern foods, what he called the foods of commerce, their health really started to go south. And so the foods of commerce you might think of as, you know, companies basically want to make money, so they prepare the foods and offer the foods in ways where they can sit on the shelf forever. And they take perfectly good milk and they pasteurize it so that it can sit on the shelf for a few more weeks and they can make more money. They take perfectly good vegetables and put them in a can so they can sit on the shelf for a couple of years. And that can is lined with BPA, which is an endocrine disruptor. So the bottom line and the theme of pretty much everything I'm going to talk about tonight is it's really important to really return to the earth as much as you can in your eating. And the closer your food comes to being how it was originally grown on the earth, the better, basically. So you should, when you look at your plate, you should be able to recognize the food. You should be able to say, wow, you know, there's an avocado and there's some beans and, you know, and whatever. You should be able to recognize what you're eating necessarily, as opposed to it being some, you know, neon orange thing coming from a Safeway or something like that. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but it's definitely important to think about. So I'm going to go through a variety of things here. There's probably going to be plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. So, you know, my plan is to get through this in about an hour, give or take, you know, 10-15 minutes, and then open it up for questions. If you guys have any questions as I'm going through this, definitely don't be shy. Just raise your hand, and we'll see if I can answer it. So here we go. So the first thing that is important to think about, and so many people don't think about this when they are trying to figure out how to improve their health, is water. Our bodies are typically about 70% water. You know, as we age, that can go all the way down to like maybe 50%. But 50% or more of our body is water. So this is like almost the most important nutrient. So considering your water intake is really an important thing to do. And so the water needs to be pure. And we don't want to be drinking tap water. We don't want to be drinking water that's been chlorinated or had fluoride put in it. We want to get water ideally as close to the water that we originally were drinking in indigenous cultures, which is something like spring water. And ideally high mountain spring water. A lot of the times the lower elevation springs are contaminated because the water table has been contaminated. So really I see the ideal water that we could be drinking is high mountain spring water. Unfortunately, most of us really don't have the opportunity to get up there and harvest our water and then come all the way down here to the lowlands with our water. It's not really practical. So we have to settle for something else. And we have a nice water source right down there in downtown Olympia. The city of Olympia is testing that water every month. So we can be assured that there's a certain level of purity, very low nitrates in that water. That's a really good sign that it hasn't been contaminated in any way from any runoff. So it's good quality water. That's a great water source for the community. But in lieu of that, some sort of filtration system. The co-op has some nice filtration systems that are putting water through multiple steps, and you can purchase a glass container, 3-gallon glass containers from custompure.com. Is a place to get nice glass dispensers. So what I do is I go down and fill up at the spring downtown, and then I just have a little crock that I turn my water upside down, put it in that crock. I've got some crystals at the bottom of that crock to kind of charge the water with life force energy to make it more like the kind of water when it's coming fresh out of the earth. Things like quartz crystals and whatnot you can put in the bottom of your crock if you really want to charge your water. And you really should be consuming about half your body weight in ounces at least. So if you weigh, like me, 160 pounds, I want to really be consuming about 80 ounces of water. 160 divided by 2 is 80, so that's about how many ounces of water I want to be drinking per day. And you might think, wow, when you take your weight divided by 2, that's a lot of water. And so you want to slowly work your way into that. If you start drinking half your body weight in water today, you might be in the bathroom 10, 15 times a day, and that's really inconvenient with whatever your work schedule is. So if you ease into that, slowly but surely your body gets hydrated and it can hold more and more water. And you won't have to go to the bathroom so much, and you're going to be a lot healthier. Water is so critical for the health of our systems. It transports all our nutrients, it helps us get rid of all the toxins. It's absolutely critical for a healthy metabolism to be drinking adequate water. And one thing to know, a lot of people drink diuretics, things like coffee, black tea, soda, alcohol, fruit juice, that's another diuretic. Basically stimulates urination. So if you're consuming any of these diuretic beverages, the standard formula would be, if you're consuming like 12 ounces of coffee, multiply that by 1.5. So that'd be another 18 ounces of water you want to add into your daily water regimen. So if you need to drink 80 ounces of water, but you're drinking 12 ounces of coffee a day, then you'd want to add 18 more ounces to the 80 ounces of water. So you get up to 98 ounces of water. I really don't usually recommend people go much over 100 ounces of water a day. That you can drink too much water, you can be overhydrated. But take that into account if you're drinking a lot of diuretics. I like reverse osmosis water, which is the kind of water that's coming out of the filters in the co-op, but it's pretty much demineralized. So when I get reverse osmosis water like that, or distilled water, I like to remineralize it, to put some absorbable minerals into that water, because distilled water can be okay to do for a cleanse or a detox or something like that, but long term, I think it really steals minerals from your water, because there's distilled water is like water in a vacuum. Water really wants to have some minerals in it, and so if it's totally devoid of minerals like reverse osmosis or distilled, it'll try to steal minerals from the environment. If you consume water like that, it'll try to steal minerals from your body. So I like to remineralize my water. What I do is I put a 1/4 teaspoon of high quality salt per gallon of water when I have reverse osmosis or distilled, to remineralize it before I put it into the crock at my home. which is what I used to do before I moved to Olympia. I had access to this great spring, so since the spring is spring water already has minerals, so now I don't put salt in my water anymore. But that's what I used to do back in the day. There's a nice book called Your Body's Many Cries for Water if you want to really get inspired to help you stay hydrated so that you don't forget. This is a really great book to read to just really reiterate the importance of staying hydrated. Salt, people are afraid of salt. Salt's been demonized in our culture, and I really do think that processed salt, table salt, sodium chloride, which is salt that's been processed at high temperatures, and all the minerals have been removed from it. So you simply have sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is not healthy for you to consume. It's somewhat toxic in the body, and a lot of sodium chloride can create high blood pressure. And it's sort of the hidden ingredient. When we eat all these processed foods, packaged foods in cans and boxes and various other packages at the grocery store, almost always they have salt in them because it makes them taste good. And usually they have a lot of salt. So if you eat a lot of these processed foods, you're getting massive amounts of salt. And it's not healthy salt. It's sodium chloride that's devoid of all the other minerals. And so it creates imbalances in your body. It imbalances the sodium-potassium ratio in your body, which is really critical for the health of your cells. You need to have a balance in the sodium and potassium in your body for your cells to be healthy. And if you're eating all that sodium chloride in the processed foods, you're going to be very imbalanced, and your cells are not going to be able to bring in nutrition and excrete toxins very efficiently if you get imbalanced in your sodium-potassium ratio. So start consuming healthy salt, salt that's unprocessed and hasn't been heated at extremely high temperatures. And I have a couple of brands here: Himalayan salt, real salt, and Celtic sea salt. These are all good quality salts. Lots of minerals in there besides sodium and chloride. And if your only salt source in your diet is the salt that you add to your food, because you're buying all whole foods from the produce department and the bulk bin and the dairy department and the meat department, instead of these packaged foods that are already loaded with salt, you're going to be in good shape if you're just consuming one of these three salts in moderate quantities. It's actually going to nourish your body with minerals, so it's a good thing. Really good book, Water and Salt, to really inspire you on the importance of consuming healthy salt. And one of the ways you can actually get minerals in your body, I actually buy Himalayan salt crystals from the company that sells this book, Water and Salt. And they're fairly large salt crystals from the Himalayan mountains, and I just put those salt crystals in purified water and basically let them dissolve to the point where the water is completely saturated with salt. And this Himalayan salt is loaded with quality minerals that are easily absorbable in the body. So I just simply take a teaspoon of that highly salty water and just add that to my quart of water that I carry around with me throughout the day and drink, to just make my water a really rich source of minerals to help remineralize my body. Another area where people really start to struggle is sugar. If you look at the indigenous cultures in our world, they really didn't consume sugar. They didn't have access to it. Maybe every 6 months they'd find a hive of bees and get a little honey. But that was about the extent of the sugar that they consumed. They didn't really eat any high glycemic foods of significance. Their diet was a lot of fiber, quality proteins, a fair amount of fat, and almost no high glycemic foods. Well, here we are in the modern world. We've got refined grains that are highly glycemic. We've got fruit that's been hybridized to be excessively sweet. Just to think of an apple, a crab apple. That's what an apple is supposed to taste like. But our apples have been hybridized to the point where they contain excessive amounts of sugar. So our modern fruit is extremely glycemic compared to what things like crab apples, things like salmon berries. If you've ever had a salmon berry around here in the springtime, that's what fruit's supposed to taste like. And there's a little bit of sweetness there, but it's astringent, it's got some bitterness, there's some sourness, there's all sorts of nuances of flavors in there. That's the kind of fruit our ancestors ate. They didn't eat cantaloupes or watermelons. That really wasn't even around back then. These are products of modern hybridization. And so we've got all these foods that spike our blood sugar, and then we've created these table sugar, sucrose, basically, that's highly refined, that is just incredibly glycemic, and there's no minerals in table sugar. So we've got a problem because our body, our metabolism, our genetics is not set up to handle that kind of sugar. And really, fats and saturated fats and cholesterol have been demonized for a good 50 years now in the media as being bad for us and what causes heart disease. But really, intake of things like saturated fats has come down in the last 50 years with all that education, but heart disease has continued to rise. I mean, if you look at the indigenous cultures, they ate tons of animal products with saturated fat, tons of cholesterol. Look at the Inuit Indians up in the North Slope in Alaska. Pretty much all they eat is meat. Tons of cholesterol, tons of saturated fat, almost no heart disease in their culture. So clearly fat and cholesterol are not the problem. Fat and cholesterol can be a problem if they're unhealthy fat and cholesterol. And pretty much all fat and cholesterol is healthy unless you mess with it and heat it to really high temperatures and oxidize it. Then it becomes a problem. Then it becomes damaging. If you take good, healthy, polyunsaturated oil and you hydrogenate it to turn it into margarine, now it's a problem. That fat has been messed with and turned into lots of trans fatty acids and other chemicals in the hydrogenated oils that are very damaging to our health. So yes, these kinds of fats are not good, but healthy, unadulterated fats and cholesterol are very health promoting in our body. And it's not a problem. What really hurts us is the sugar. If you look at the indigenous cultures, as they began to consume modern diets that were very glycemic, that's when their health started to go south. So sugar's a problem, and we really need to watch the glycemic nature of our diet. Sugar feeds all sorts of things like parasites and fungi and yeast and cancer in our bodies, exactly the kind of things we don't want to be feeding. So we really need to begin to reduce the glycemic nature of our diet. And that can be a little challenging because sugar is like one of the most addictive substances on the planet. Really, I've heard it said that sugar is actually more addictive than cocaine. So here we are as modern humans. I don't know about you guys, but I grew up, I remember dinners of like Mountain Dew and ice cream. That was my dinner. When you grow up on stuff like that, and it's just like, you're an addict. You're literally addicted, and yet coming off that is hard. There's some healthier sweeteners that I've listed here that might be a good thing to play with to come off some of these more intense sugars, refined sugars that people are consuming. Jerusalem artichoke syrup. They sell this at the co-op, I'm pretty sure. I know they sell it up north at Marlene's. Glycemic index of 14, that's really low. It's got a lot of inulin in it, which is a good prebiotic that can help keep your intestinal ecology strong. It's got a real sort of syrupy, strong flavor. I mean, it's not a clean sugar that's just going to add sweetness. It's going to add some syrupy flavor too, so just be aware of that. Yacon syrup, also a very low glycemic index. This is a syrup that is created by cooking down and then pressing out a syrup of a yacon root, which is a root that grows in South America that's got some natural low glycemic sweetness to it. And you can also buy yacon root, which has a nice sweetness to it that you can add to things like smoothies to sweeten up your smoothie. And it's also got a lot of prebiotic inulin in there. Inulin is a complex sugar that feeds friendly bacteria in your gut. If you've got a lot of intestinal dysbiosis, like unfriendly microbes in your gut, these prebiotics may not be the best thing for you right now. You might need to wait until you get a little healthier in your intestinal ecology before you start consuming these sweeteners with prebiotics in them, because sometimes these prebiotics, a lot of people feel, can feed unhealthy bacteria as well as healthy bacteria. So if you've got a candida overgrowth and you're eating a lot of prebiotics like Jerusalem artichoke or Jerusalem artichoke syrup, potentially you could be exacerbating that situation. Best to wait till you've got your intestinal ecology a little more balanced, and then you can begin to do this sort of thing. Coconut crystals or coconut syrup, you can definitely get this at the co-op. Much lower glycemic index, loaded with minerals. I really like coconut sugar because it doesn't have a lot of fructose in it. You know, things like agave nectar, loaded with fructose. Fructose in its free state, you know, fruit has fructose. When you're eating a whole fruit like an apple, the fructose in the fruit is really not going to hurt you so much because it's in a whole food state. It's in a food matrix with many other things with it, like fiber, for example, and minerals. But when you refine something down into a sweetener that has a lot of fructose in it, like high fructose corn syrup or agave syrup, which actually has more fructose than high fructose corn syrup, you can potentially create some problems because fructose is metabolized by the liver. It's very hard on your liver. It really is, some people are theorizing, is one of the prime causes of diabetes in our culture, which is an epidemic at this stage. So I don't particularly like to consume sugars that have a lot of fructose in it, like agave or certainly not high fructose corn syrup. But coconut crystals, very low in free fructose, tons of minerals, very low glycemic index. I really like that as a sweetener, and you obviously want to use these in moderation. Honey has a fairly high glycemic index. It will spike your blood sugar, and as we mentioned, when you spike your blood sugar, you start to feed things in your body that you don't want to feed, like bacteria, yeast, cancer, fungi, etc. But a particular kind of honey called Manuka honey out of New Zealand is very high in antimicrobial properties. So honey could potentially feed unfriendly things you don't want to be feeding in your body, but with all the antimicrobial compounds in Manuka honey, it doesn't do that. And Manuka honey, I've heard of practitioners actually using Manuka honey to help people reduce things like candida and whatnot because of the antimicrobial aspect of it. I'd be a little leery of that because there's so much sugar and you have the potential to be feeding candida. But certainly Manuka honey in moderation, I think, is a good option for a sweetener. It's got a little more of a syrupy flavor than regular honey, so it's not as a clean sweetener as regular honey, but it's got a nice sweet flavor. It's definitely enjoyable. And then my favorite things to use personally, if I want to sweeten up a smoothie, or if I'm making some homemade chocolate, and I want to have a little bit of sweetness in there, but I don't want to put table sugar, is mesquite powder, lucuma powder, and carob powder. I like these because they're simply whole foods that have been dried and then crushed into a powder. So carob powder you're probably all familiar with. That's sort of a chocolate substitute. Lucuma powder is, I really like lucuma powder. It's probably my favorite of these three because it's the least glycemic. Lucuma is a fruit that grows in South America, and it's got a lot of fat in it. Lucuma is very rich in fat. It's almost like avocado status for fat. And when you dry that fruit and then grind it into a powder, you've got lucuma powder. And it tastes like maple syrup. It's really nice flavor, very pleasant sweetness, but it's got a lot of fat, so it's not super glycemic as a result of that. And it's loaded with minerals and vitamins, so it's very nutritious. It's a great thing to have around to sweeten, plain yogurt, or sweeten a smoothie, or sweeten homemade chocolate that you're making. You can tell I like making homemade chocolate. I don't do it very often, but my wife sure does love it, so she talks me into doing it more than I probably like to do it. Mesquite powder is, if you go to the southwestern part of the country, you'll see trees, you've probably heard of the term mesquite grill, so it's the wood of that tree has a very smoky flavor to it, but that tree has a pod that is high in protein, high in minerals. It was actually one of the staple foods of the Apache Indians in the Southwest. And you take that pod and you dry it. It's already pretty much dry when it's on the tree. You just take it off the tree and grind it into a powder. You've got a very mineral and vitamin rich powder that tastes very pleasant. It's very sweet. It's got a really unique flavor. It's not smoky. It's really hard to describe. You'll have to try it. But it's definitely a high fiber, high protein, like 20% protein, I believe, high mineral and vitamin content, sugar substitute. So we talked about fruits. When you do give yourself some fruit, like in the summertime when fruit's in season around here, I love blueberries. I'll buy a whole pint of blueberries and eat them. But I like to have a little bit of fat with my fruit. That's a way to help keep the glycemic nature of sweet things down. If you're going to have that potato, if you're going to have that banana, if you're going to have something that's sweetened, at least have some fat with it, because that fat will slow down the rate at which that sweet thing gets into your bloodstream and keeps your blood sugar a lot more stable. Things like coconut oil are fabulous to add. Coconut butter, have you guys tried coconut butter? Oh man, it's just amazing. It's the meat of the coconut that is basically blended into a butter. So I make my own. I buy coconut chips that you can get, in the internet, online. You can buy coconut chips from a variety of different retailers. Just get unheated, dried coconut chips, and then I put them in my food processor. And I let my food processor run for like 10 minutes. And the coconut butter has a melting point of like 76 degrees, so it doesn't take long in that food processor for the temperature to get above 76 degrees. It melts and it blends into a nice smooth liquid that will literally pour when you turn your when you turn your food processor upside down. You can just pour that liquid into a container and then put the lid on the container, put it in the refrigerator. Half an hour later, it's solidified into coconut butter. And I like just eating this stuff by the spoonful. So in the summer, it's so good. I mean, I'm literally addicted to this stuff. But when I have my pint of blueberries, I just have a couple of spoonfuls of coconut butter. It tastes really good, and coconut butter is just so good for you. It's a saturated fat that is highly antimicrobial. It's got medium chain fatty acids that have all these great antimicrobial, antiviral properties. So it really helps keep the microbial load down in your body, as well as giving you some very good fat to keep the glycemic nature of whatever you consume it with down. So grains. Grains are pretty controversial these days, and for good reason. I mean, I'm happy about this big debate about grains, because it's about time we have this debate as a culture. The grains really weren't consumed by primitive cultures. 10,000 years ago, you didn't find anybody on the planet eating grains. Grains are a product of modern agriculture, where you're able to harvest. I mean, imagine trying to harvest enough quinoa out in the wild to have a meal. You might find a quinoa little patch over here, harvest a few little pieces of grain. It would take you about an hour. And then, maybe 2 days later you'd find another patch or something like that. So really, these are not foods that humans have ever consumed up until the advent of agriculture, when we started actually cultivating food and developing techniques to harvest it and process it so that we can actually go into a bulk bin in a health food store and buy quinoa in sufficient quantities to make a meal out of it. And grains really have 3 strikes against them in terms of being healthy food. The first strike is they're fairly glycemic. Even whole grains. People say, well, I'm eating whole grains, I don't have to worry about that. But really, you look at the glycemic index of whole grains, and most of them are pretty glycemic. They're above 50. They'll break down into sugar fairly quickly, especially if those grains have been extruded through a high temperature and high heat process to turn those grains into pasta or breakfast cereal, or because literally the fiber has been pulverized. And now you don't have any fiber buffering the glycemic nature of those grains, and they're highly glycemic. So that's the first strike against grains. They're glycemic. Second strike against grains is they have gluten in them. What technically is a grain is defined as a seed that'll grow into grass. So we're talking barley, we're talking rye, we're talking wheat, we're talking spelt, kamut, and oats. These all grow in the grasses, and all the grains that grow in the grasses have gluten in them, and gluten is a protein that literally we can't digest effectively. And so it's a big food allergy problem. And with the advent of hybridization, we've really altered the nature of these grains to the point where now there's all sorts of other proteins in them that are very bad for us. And there's a book called Wheat Belly out that, excellent book. We're doing a book club night in March on that book. To just talk about it and help motivate people to come off gluten. Because I think it's one of the most important things you can do to support your health is get off gluten. Gluten was a substance that originally was used to make glue, and thus the name gluten. It's very sticky. So one of the things that gluten does when you eat it is that sticky substance literally coats your intestinal wall with a coat of that sticky material that can potentially harden and solidify in there and start to block effective nutrient absorption and contribute to impacted material coating your intestinal walls that becomes a home for all sorts of unfriendly things like parasites and candida and whatnot. Not to mention the fact that we can't digest gluten, so it's a potential food allergy problem. And then there's all these other proteins in wheat. So coming off gluten is one of the most important things you can do to benefit your health. You know, if you're having trouble coming off gluten, a baby step you can take is start to consume sprouted grains. Because when you sprout a grain, you dramatically reduce the gluten content. So there's all sorts of like sprouted grain tortillas, sprouted grain breads, that are available for purchase in health food stores, sprouted grain bagels, sprouted grain just about everything that you could do, and those are much better. A lot of the gluten has been transformed in the sprouting process, and a lot of the anti-nutrients have been destroyed in the sprouting process, and that's really the third strike against grains, is they have a lot of anti-nutrients. So specifically grains, and this also, by the way, is true for seeds and nuts and legumes. They have a lot of anti-nutrients. And by anti-nutrients, I mean all plants don't really want to be eaten. Plants basically just want to grow into a plant. So they develop these defenses to avoid from being consumed by various fungi and bacteria and people like us, humans. And these compounds, when we eat them, are somewhat toxic. They're a mild, low-level toxin. And so in grains, you've got things like enzyme inhibitors, you've got lectins, which damage your intestinal health, help to contribute to things like leaky gut. You've got phytates, phytic acid, which basically binds with minerals and prevents the minerals from being absorbed properly in your body. So those are some significant strikes against grains as a food: glycemic, gluten, and anti-nutrients. So my recommendation is, number one, you can remove one of these strikes if you just start consuming non-glutinous grains, which I've listed: amaranth, quinoa, millet, buckwheat, teff, and rice. These are grains which don't have any gluten. So now one of the strikes has been removed. The other strike, though, fairly glycemic, still exists. So when you consume these grains, highly recommend that you consume them with fat. So when you cook up your bowl of quinoa, when it's done, it's nice and warm. Take a nice big pat of butter, nice grass-fed butter, and mix it in. It'll melt in really nicely. Stir that in to get some fat in there with that grain, or some coconut oil, or some olive oil. So mix these healthy fats in there. You're going to make up a quinoa salad, add some avocado to it. Get some healthy fat in there so it's not such a glycemic experience for your body. The third strike, anti-nutrients. Highly recommended that you prepare the grains in such a way that you remove a significant percentage of these anti-nutrients. And there's a number of different ways to do that. You can investigate this on the internet, but I'll just tell you a couple of different ways this is kind of a pain to do. I have to be honest. Preparing your grains in this way is a pain in the butt. But if you're really interested in health and you want to consume grains, you have to do this. Because if you consume grains without removing the anti-nutrients, you're not going to get a whole lot of minerals out of whatever you consume that bowl of quinoa with. Because all the phytic acid in the quinoa is going to be binding with things like calcium and zinc and magnesium, and chelating these out of your body. You don't get a chance to absorb them because they're bound to the phytic acid. You've got to remove that phytic acid. So one of the ways to remove the anti-nutrients like lectins and phytic acid and enzyme inhibitors is to sprout the grain prior to cooking it. And there's a company called True Roots that is offering sprouted quinoa and sprouted lentils that have already been dried. You just purchase those and you can cook them right up. They don't have a whole lot of anti-nutrients because they've been sprouted. There's another website called, spacing the name of the website, it's American something, maybe it'll come to me. But basically, Flower of Life is what you want to Google. Flower of Life. This is sprouted grain flour. So these are non-glutinous grains that have been sprouted and ground into flour. So they're low in anti-nutrients. All you have to do is when you make them into something, make sure you add fat, and basically drastically mitigated these 3 strikes if you consume those. Otherwise, if you want to remove the anti-nutrients yourself, the way I do it is I'll take my quinoa, I'll soak it overnight, and then in the morning, actually what I do is I basically put my quinoa in a jar and I put a mesh lid that I have that goes on my jars, and then I just rinse and drain my quinoa maybe 3 or 4 times just to wash off all the saponins come off. You'll see the water's a little bit colored. I keep doing that rinsing and draining until the water rinses off clear. And then you're ready to soak the quinoa. So then I add water to the quinoa, twice as much water as the quinoa. So if I fill up my jar to here with quinoa, I'm filling it up to here with water. And then I just set it aside for 2 days on the kitchen countertop at room temperature. And what happens if you set it aside for 2 days like that, it starts to ferment. And in the fermentation process, it's friendly bacteria that are typically doing the fermentation. You want to use filtered water to soak. You don't want to use chlorinated water because that will not allow any bacteria to grow. You want to use filtered water, and then these friendly bacteria start to ferment. They produce phytase, which is an enzyme that breaks down the phytic acid. And the enzyme inhibitors get washed away. A lot of the lectins are reduced. So fermentation is an effective way to remove these anti-nutrients from your grains. So you want to think about all 3 of these strikes against grains before you consume them, and also know that these strikes are present with legumes as well, and they are also present with seeds and nuts. So I typically won't consume something like almonds or walnuts unless I soak it overnight. Minimum, bare minimum, with seeds and nuts to remove at least the enzyme inhibitors. Man, time flies. I can't believe we're already 7:45. All right. I talk too much. Okay, so let's talk about fats and oils. Oils are pretty processed. When you press a seed into an oil, you remove the oil from the protective seed coat. Like a flaxseed. Flax has a really hard coating that's protecting that very fragile omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in flax from oxidation so it doesn't go rancid. But as soon as you press the oil out of that flax, that oil is naked. It's exposed to light and oxygen, which will create rancidity fairly easily. So a lot of these oils, I would recommend you avoid oils that are sold on the grocery store shelf in a clear plastic container. Because of the fact that these oils typically are fairly high in either mono or polyunsaturated fats, which are very fragile to degradation from light, which it's exposed to because it's in a clear plastic container, and oxygen, because the jar is probably not oxygen flushed. All plastic also is permeable to oxygen, so as the product sits there on the shelf, oxygen is getting through the bottle and oxidizing the oils, turning them into rancidity. So the exception to that would be coconut oil or palm oil, because coconut oil and palm oil are very rich in saturated fats, which is very stable. Doesn't tend to go rancid. So coconut or palm oil, both of which are sold at the co-op, by the way, are acceptable to purchase in a clear container on a grocery store shelf. They're not going to hurt you. They're quality food. Palm oil, by the way, has the most vitamin A and vitamin E of any vegetable oil on the planet. And you'll notice the palm oil is red because it's loaded with all sorts of different carotenoids, which turn into vitamin A if your body's able to make that conversion. So these 5 oils I've listed here are the only oils I recommend. Coconut oil, palm oil, cold-pressed flax or hemp oils, they have to be in an opaque container, dark container, so light can't get in to create rancidity. They have to be stored in the refrigerated section because flax and hemp are very rich in these highly fragile essential fatty acids, so they have to be protected. And you want to make sure you store these oils, flax and hemp, at home in your refrigerator after you open them. And I also recommend buying them in a smallest container possible. Don't buy the big massive containers of flax oil, because that stuff, once you open it up, you got a couple weeks before you start to get significant rancidity in your flax oil. So buy a small jar. One of the tricks that I do with my olive oil, which is the next oil on the list here, I like to buy the big bottles of olive oil. But if you don't do my little trick, I'd recommend buying the small bottles of olive oil. Because olive oil, it's stored on the grocery store shelf, not in the refrigerator. It's usually just in green glass, and it's high in monounsaturated fats, which are somewhat fragile. especially if it's extra virgin. Extra virgin olive oil has some compounds in it that help, actually it goes rancid fairly quickly. It's pretty fragile. I can't remember what that is, but when you press olives, there's some compound that comes out of it. When you press it in the extra virgin techniques, I can't remember exactly what it is, but Mercola wrote a big article about it. As it's fairly fragile, so ideally you should store this in the refrigerator. That's kind of a pain in the butt because you put olive oil in the refrigerator, it turns solid. Then you want to pour it over your salad dressing. You turn it out, you got to run it under the hot water in your refrigerator to melt it. Pain in the butt. So I purchased an antioxidant called astaxanthin. It's the most potent fat-soluble antioxidant that we know of. And you can get it in little capsules. And I take this as something to benefit my health. But also when I buy olive oil, I open up the bottle and I take an astaxanthin capsule and I break it open and squeeze it into my olive oil. Now what's it? Astaxanthin. A-S-T-A-Z-A, so it's A-S-T-A-Z-A-N-T-H-A-N. Something along those lines. There's an X in there somewhere. So if you Google that, Google will correct the spelling for you. So, and I like Mercola's astaxanthin. That's the one I use. But there's some good astaxanthins on the shelves in health food stores as well, from Hawaii.
So you put that in your olive oil?
On my olive oil, and it turns my olive oil red because astaxanthin is what's in salmon. It's what makes salmon flesh red, and it's why salmon flesh is relatively stable. Nature is intelligent. Salmon's full of omega-3 fatty acids that are very fragile, but it's also full of astaxanthin. It's healthy, wild-caught salmon that protects those omega-3s. And so you can use that very potent fat-soluble antioxidant to protect your oils and have them last a little longer.
You still refrigerate it?
I don't.
You don't?
No.
Okay. So you use that in place of refrigeration?
Allowing me to have a convenient olive oil that will dribble on my salad dressing. So that's the fat topic. And obviously give up margarine. It's the fact that we ever were sold on the fact that margarine is healthy and butter is not is one of the biggest travesties. That in and of itself should make you question anything you hear in popular media that's being propagated as the latest healthy thing, because usually there's a financial interest behind it that's motivating. Unfortunately, a lot of our media is sort of in the pocket of big industry, and therefore it's important that you educate yourself and not just blindly, follow whatever is being touted. So coconut oil and palm oil and butter for cooking, especially frying. If you're going to fry, only fry with these fats. Coconut oil, palm oil, and butter. Every other oil is just too high in fragile fats. Palm oil, coconut oil, and butter are the only ones that are acceptable.
Even avocado oil?
Avocado oil is too high in the monounsaturated fats. And it's got a fair amount of essential fatty acids in there too. Not a whole lot, but enough. And it's just not ideal to fry with olive oil. There's another oil that I forgot to mention, cold-pressed sesame oil. I think that's an acceptable oil because sesame is very rich in essential fatty acids, specifically omega-6 and monounsaturated fats, so it's a very fragile oil. But sesame oil is unique. There's certain, if it's cold-pressed, there are a couple of very strong antioxidants that are in sesame seeds that come out into the oil. And therefore keeps the oil relatively stable. And there's a company called Eden, which is producing sesame oil that is cold pressed, and it's packaged in a nice dark glass container that I believe is nitrogen flushed as well. So that's sesame oil done right, and that's sesame oil you could consume. Wouldn't recommend frying with sesame oil, and when you open the jar up, I'd recommend putting that in your refrigerator after you open it. But that's an oil that you can also consume safely. That is, I consider healthy.
So you wouldn't add astaxanthin to that?
You could, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, sesame oil. I might. I don't really buy this oil, but if you do, that might be a good idea because it's there's a lot of omega-6 fats, which are super fragile in sesame oil, and so just to be on the safe side. One of the worst things you can do for your health is rancid fats.
Is what?
rancid fats. And anytime you press an oil out of the seed, you have a high possibility of rancidity forming, you know, in that fat, because it's not protected anymore by the seed coat. Okay, chemicals. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but bottom line is, if you can't pronounce it, don't consume it.
Except for esthesis.
There you go. All right, call me out as a hypocrite on that one. I got you. So yeah, totally. You know, with some exceptions like astaxanthin, if you can't pronounce it, don't consume it. But yeah, start reading labels. And man, there's so many chemicals in our food. I mean, it's horrendous. These chemicals put in there to make things taste good, to make things preserve a long time, to make things look good. It's a crime, in my opinion. It's a crime against the population, what's being done. So protect yourself, read labels, and get away from these chemicals. My goodness, I've heard it said that the average American in the U.S. is exposed to 2 million chemicals on a daily basis. That's nuts. Our liver is not designed to handle that. Our liver, one of the many things it does is cleans our blood. It's its job, is to make sure our blood stays clean. And our liver is not designed to handle 2 million chemicals a day. And many of these chemicals, stuff like dioxin and DDT, our liver doesn't know what to do with. It doesn't have the hardware to process these kind of chemicals. Oftentimes it just our body has to stuff these things in our fat cells to get them out of the circulation so they don't hurt us. So our liver is stressed. The last thing you want to do is stress your liver, which does 500 plus important metabolic processes in your body with more chemicals through your food. So definitely buy organically grown produce when possible, and start reading labels. Foods produced by the Matrix are designed to keep you in the Matrix. It's my little ode to Neo.
Yeah.
So, all right, dairy products. One thing to know about animal foods, they're top of the food chain. So animal foods concentrate the chemicals in the environment. I don't advocate a vegan or vegetarian diet because there are certain nutrients, as those of you that read my talk or watched my talk from last week know, are very difficult to get in a vegan or vegetarian context, especially a vegan context. But you don't want to be going crazy with animal foods these days. You don't want like the bulk of your diet to be animal foods. You eat enough animal products to stay healthy, to get all your vitamin K2, EPA and DHA, vitamin A needs met, etc. But you don't go excessive on that. And when the animal products you do consume, it's important that they be clean, because factory farming is another crime against not only the human population, but also the animal population. What's done to our animals these days is criminal. And our animals are so sick. They're so, like cattle, natural food for cows is grass, but they're feeding them corn because they can make a lot more money if they do that. It's cheaper. They don't have to let them pasture. They don't have to go get them. It's a lot less labor to take care of the cows. Just stuff them in a pen, keep them there, and feed them this GMO corn. And the cows, that's like feeding a human plastic or something. This is not a natural food for cows. Cows get so sick eating this food, especially because it's GMO, which destroys your whole intestinal health. That they got to keep these cows alive by pumping them full of antibiotics and whatnot. And they also pump them full of antibiotics because it makes the cows gain weight, it increases the profit, and pump these animals full of hormones. And so by the time you consume these meats or dairy that's coming from these animals, it's loaded with hormones and antibiotics. And it's like, you know, if you're consuming dairy and meat products from Safeway, you're eating antibiotics every meal. And therefore, you're destroying your intestinal ecology every time you eat food. And just remember, your intestinal bacteria, you should have 3 to 5 pounds of bacteria in your gut, 100 trillion bacteria in your gut, and they're like an internal organ. They do hundreds of different metabolic processes for you. They're every bit as important as your liver, is how I see it. So every time you consume an antibiotic, I'm not saying you should never do antibiotics. They can save your life sometimes. Sometimes these things can be beneficial, but certainly I would recommend not consuming animal products that are laced with antibiotics, because every time you do that, you're destroying your intestinal health. It's like you're getting an operation every meal. You're removing an internal organ. You know, that these bacteria that are doing hundreds of different metabolic processes for you, every time you consume these antibiotics in your food, you're destroying them. And now these hundreds of different really important things are not getting done in your body. So definitely switch. There's a great little shop down there on Black Lake Boulevard, Farm Fresh Northwest it's called, that sells only grass-fed meats and wild-caught fish and pasture-raised chickens and eggs and raw milk.
Where is this again? I'm sorry.
Black Lake Boulevard. Yeah, you go down Highway 101, get off of Black Lake Boulevard, make a left and go south for about half a mile. It's right by the Texaco there.
Sushi food
Right
restaurant.
by the sushi food restaurant, exactly.
Sushi house.
Man, let's as a community come together and support this business. This is the kind of business we want in our community that's partnering with local farmers to get these healthy animal foods and offering them to the public in this store in a convenient location. So let's support this store. They've got some great stuff in there like paleo wraps, which are basically tortillas made out of coconut. They taste phenomenal. And they're very low glycemic, and they've got all sorts of gluten-free products in there. So it's a neat little store. They've got produce in there as well. Definitely local honey. Great little store. Definitely want to support that store. But one thing to know about dairy is it's the #1 food allergy on planet Earth. And that's for good, understandable reasons. Cow's milk has about 4 different protein fractions in it that humans don't have enzymes to digest. I mean, it's cow's milk. That kind of makes sense, right? It's not really designed for humans, so the fact there's 4 proteins in there we don't have enzymes for. But if the milk is raw, it comes with its own enzymes that will digest those proteins for us, and it can serve as good nutrition for our body. If we don't have a sensitivity to dairy, which unfortunately many of us do, or an intolerance. Which I'm going to talk about in February, difference between intolerances and sensitivities and allergies. But if we don't have any of those, we can consume dairy products in moderation, but I would recommend only raw, because only then can you adequately digest dairy. If it's been pasteurized, you're going to have some proteins in there you got no hope of digesting, and there's a high possibility of a food sensitivity or food allergy as a result of that. So keep your dairy products raw. Make sure it's from animals that are grass-fed. And you want 100% grass-fed ideally, because that's when the milk's going to be healthy. It's not, grass-finished. You want 100% grass-fed ideally. And you want organic, so it's not full of hormones and antibiotics.
Doug,
Yeah.
is there any risk with raw?
There could be. Evan, you got something to say about that? Or were you just raising your hands to the... Okay, let's want to say something. There could be, but typically, if the animal's healthy, the milk is loaded with friendly bacteria that will naturally sour. These friendly bacteria, as they age a food, will sour it, like sauerkraut, which is very good for us. So sour cream, full of friendly bacteria that are actually good for us. So if the animal's healthy, the milk will be healthy, full of primarily friendly bacteria that will actually nourish us. But if the animal's unhealthy, they'll produce milk that's full of pus and full of unfriendly microbes and full of all sorts of stuff that is great food for unfriendly microbes. Then unfriendly microbes are going to get going in there, and then somebody's going to drink that and get sick, and then some government agency is going to say, hey, we got to start pasteurizing all our milk, because this is how the whole thing got started. So if you're getting your milk from healthy animals, and here in the Pacific Northwest, we have an amazing opportunity to do that, because we live in this incredibly lush, rich grass everywhere. The cows can be really healthy. So if you're going to do dairy, this is a place to do it. But just make sure you don't have a sensitivity or an intolerance to dairy. And that's really important, because as we'll talk about next month, if you're consuming something you're sensitive to, you're damaging your body. So you got to make sure you evaluate that. These are some of the things I work with people on here in the clinic, is evaluating their sensitivities. Meat, same thing. You want the meat to be grass-fed. You want the fish to be wild-caught. I was just reading an article the other day about factory farm salmon, and how horribly unhealthy it is, how loaded it is with chemicals, heavy metals, all sorts of stuff. So stay away from that. Eat only wild-caught fish. And the oceans, unfortunately, are getting more and more polluted, so do your best to eat low on the food chain. About as high on the food chain as I would go with salmon, with fish. I'd stay away from tuna, too much mercury, too high on the food chain. Salmon, sardines, anchovies. We got a great recipe that Stacy just put up on the website was for salmon, for sardines the other day. You're like, sardines, oh man, I can't even stand the smell. But apparently Evan will testify to the fact that this is quite tasty. So this is a way to eat sardines, which are really rich in omega-3 fatty acids that are very good for us. They're very low on the food chain. This is a very healthy food to be putting in our bodies. And also start to play around with some good quality protein sources like hemp seeds that are very hypoallergenic, that are very rich in omega-3 fats, very rich in minerals. Hemp seeds are the most mineral-rich seed on the planet, from what I understand. So they're loaded with minerals. Spirulina is another phenomenally mineral-rich, high-protein food that's very low on the food chain. It's literally the base of the food chain on planet Earth. Some good quality, non-toxic protein sources. And properly prepared seeds, nuts, legumes, and glutinous grains, prepared to remove those anti-nutrients. And then non-starchy vegetables. This wants to be at least 50% of each meal. Things like zucchini and cucumbers and peppers. These are vegetables that are non-starchy, so they don't spike your blood sugar in any way, and they're very rich in minerals. Sea vegetables are very good for us, 20 times more mineral rich than land-based vegetables, and that's really one of the big problems in our culture these days is we don't have any minerals in our food. So eating sea vegetables is a great remedy for that. However, as I said, the oceans, I'm a little leery of eating any sea vegetables out of the Pacific right now with what's going on with Fukushima. And sea vegetables are an algae, and algae mops up pollution. So you got to make sure you get your sea vegetables from a good source. I really like Maine seacoast veggies. They're harvesting their sea veggies from the northern shore of Maine. They're doing stringent testing on all their sea veggies for radioactivity, for heavy metals, for bacteria, and they have to pass stringent tests before they'll sell them. So if they're selling it, it's been tested to be pure. So I eat a lot of sea veggies, but I get them all from Maine seacoast veggies that I just mail order. And then the final thing is GMOs. I mean, this is something that many people don't pay attention to. I highly encourage you to pay attention to this topic. GMOs are, if you want to destroy your health, this is one of the fastest ways to do it. Because GMOs, through this genetic modification that scientists are doing, are creating all these very strange, never before seen proteins in our food. And you look at the rise, have you guys noticed food allergies are dramatically increasing in our population? Well, if you look at the rise of GMOs in our food supply and the rise of food allergies, it's a very similar curve. So I'm not saying it's 100% GMOs that are causing this, but I think that's a big piece of the puzzle of what's happening. These GMOs are, with these strange proteins, are creating food sensitivities, and anytime you eat something you're sensitive to, you damage your intestinal tract and create more leaky gut, which leads to more food sensitivities. So staying away from GMOs is super important. Also, GMOs, they're engineering a lot of plants to be able to produce their own pesticides. So that the plant doesn't have to be sprayed because it makes its own pesticide that will kill the bugs. But these GMO foods are able to transfer their DNA to our intestinal bacteria. So then our intestinal bacteria start to produce pesticides. So if you eat one of these foods that's producing its own pesticides, suddenly you create a pesticide factory inside your gut that's now spewing pesticides into your body 24/7. So it's imperative that you stay away from GMOs. And I've got this information off the nongmoproject.org website. I advise you to keep up on this website. They're constantly updating it because unfortunately more and more foods every day, every year are becoming genetically modified. So this website keeps you up to date on what the latest information is on the GMO issue. And these 10 foods at the very top are the ones that are most likely in our current food supply to be GMO. So these foods are suspect. I would never purchase these 10 foods unless they're organically grown. And frankly, I would never purchase these next 10 foods either unless they're organically grown. These foods are typically not contaminated, but there's a rising percentage, more and more every year, that they can be contaminated. Because there are various GMO strains that have been released into our environment, and we have the cross-pollination issue. That if you release one GMO strain, all the other foods in that family slowly get contaminated with GMO DNA. One of the ways you can avoid GMOs is to purchase 100% organically grown foods. You're not going to completely eliminate the cross-pollination issue with the 100% organically grown food, but you can at least be sure that the food was grown with a non-GMO seed, because you have to start with the non-GMO seed or the food can't be certified as organic. So you're really tipping the scale in your favor if you go 100% organic. And if you're buying processed foods that have 10, 15, 20 ingredients in there, there's a much higher likelihood that you're going to get some of those as being GMO ingredients. So just be aware that the product has to say 100% certified organic. It can still be called organic if something like 80 or 90% of the ingredients are organic. So you can have a product that says in big words on the label organic, but only 90% of the 15 or 20 things that are in there are organically grown. The other 10% are GMO, but they can still call it organic. So it has to say 100% organic on the label if you're buying processed foods that have multiple ingredients. And about 70% of our processed foods that are currently on our supermarket shelves have GMO ingredients. One of the things you can look for is this logo right here. If this is on your food, then the food has been tested through the testing protocols that this organization has created, which are very stringent, to be certified free of GMOs. So this is a great website to familiarize yourself with. And also animal foods. If the animal was fed GMO foods, it's potentially going to be contaminated. Their meat and dairy is going to be contaminated with GMO DNA. So you need to purchase grass-fed, 100% grass-fed, not just grain finished, 100% grass-fed. And you need chickens, purchase eggs from chickens that were fed 100% organic food to ensure you're not getting any GMO DNA in those foods. And one last thing I forgot to mention, all these ingredients in this paragraph right here are derived from GMO foods. So there's a potential they could be contaminated with some GMO DNA. So just be aware of that. The GMO issue is becoming more and more difficult to avoid, unfortunately. But we just have to do our best and pray that there's a turnaround in the mass consciousness of our culture when you start moving towards health and away from greed. So there you have it, folks.
Where's the water source?
4th and Jefferson.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just like the spigot, isn't it?
Yeah, the city improved the site, and it's a really nice little site. The only problem with it is there's some typically homeless folks that hang out around there, and so I don't recommend going there in the evening. I've been there in the evening, and it's felt a little uncomfortable. People have sort of gotten in my face who obviously weren't well, and so I like to go there.
The street that has a railroad track running down the middle of it?
Yeah.
Okay, I should know that because I used to go on that railroad track.
Yeah, so I like to go there in the morning or early afternoon, and that seems to be the safest time. Yeah.
I noticed you didn't list stevia as a transitional sweetener. What is your comment about that?
Good call. Stevia is good. I personally gravitate to the green stevia over the white stevia. White stevia is highly processed. It's made from the leaf of the stevia plant, but then it's processed through a number of steps to become this highly refined food. I've heard some people have some sensitivities to that, but the green stevia is simply stevia leaf from the plant that's been dried into a powder. So it's a whole food. It's got a lot of minerals in it. It's not refined in any way, and it's a lot less bitter than the white stevia. So I like to. Nativa Naturals produces green stevia powder. Nativa Naturals, and you can get that at Marlene's Market online. So, or you get it online.
Where is Marlene's Market?
Marlene's is 38th Street in Tacoma. There's also one in Federal Way, so it's about a half hour from here north. And they've got a lot of stuff that our co-op doesn't have.
It's west of I-5.
Yeah.
About 6 blocks, 7 blocks.
Yeah.
Do you have any citations, or could I get something from you at some future time about the difference in nutrients between organic and non-organic foods?
I've seen a lot of different studies that have investigated that have shown that organic, you gotta understand, when you spray pesticides on the soil, you kill all the soil-based microbes.
Yeah.
And those soil-based microbes are necessary to basically transform a crushed rock particle into an organically bound mineral that the plant can bring up into its plant body. So if you spray your crop with pesticides, not only are you adding poison to your food, you're also if there is any minerals in your soil, which there usually isn't because the farmer's just using synthetic fertilizers for year after year, so the minerals are gone. But if there were any minerals in there, the plant wouldn't be able to bring them up into the plant body anyways because all the soil-based microbes have been destroyed.
Yeah.
So it's
I'd just
usually
love
pretty
to have
striking.
something in writing about that, because people who question that, I'd love to be able to say, well, there's this article, blah, 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 you know. if there's-
Yeah, sure. So
Okay.
send me an email at
Okay.
doug@drevan.com and I'll
Great.
shoot you a link.
Great, thanks, Deb.
Sure.
What do you think about the, I can't think of the name of it, but it's the birch tree sugar?
Xylitol.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of xylitol. In moderation, it can be okay. Apparently, it's somewhat antimicrobial and good for dental health.
Yeah.
But it's highly processed, number one, I've seen a number of people who have some sort of reaction in their GI tract to it, some sort of creating some stomach pain. So I'm a little bit skeptical of xylitol. If you look at the way that's processed, very little xylitol is made from birch trees anymore. It's mostly made from like GMO corn or something
Oh,
like that.
weird.
The stuff that, I mean, again, it's the source.
Yeah.
but, the stuff that they have at the co-op seems to be different than some of the other things.
Sure, and they may be selling stuff that comes from birch trees, so that's certainly better because it's not coming from a GMO food. But you look at the processing to turn the birch sap into xylitol, it's pretty intensely processed, and since I've known a number of people who have reactions to it and our intestinal issues are on the rise in our population, I tend to steer away from it as something that I would consume in large quantities.
Sure.
Maybe something in my toothpaste or as a chewing gum to help keep my dental health going possibly, but I wouldn't really recommend, just intuitively and from my experience with people, a lot of consumption of that. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
So, I don't really know much about the glycemic index.
Sure.
But the numbers, we're supposed to choose things that have 50 or less,
Yeah.
and it's a number to me, so I don't really understand. I mean,
So yeah, it's just a measure of how much the food spikes your blood sugar, how quickly it creates a rise in blood sugar. So white bread and table sugar are rated as 100. And so then foods are measured and then compared as a percentage of table sugar and white bread. So if someone has a glycemic index of 50, it's like half of the blood sugar spiking ability of like a...
that makes sense.
Yeah, so the lower the number, the better, basically.
Where do you find a good glycemic index source chart? Like,
Just Google it. There's...
well, I did once. I didn't really find one that was easy to use.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's a number of them out there that are super comprehensive. The problem with a lot of the charts that I've seen is I want to see a chart because what I eat is whole foods. So I want to know what cherries are, what apricots are, what quinoa is, and most of the charts that are out there, have all these names of processed foods,
Right.
which I don't go near stuff like that, and I don't care about because I never eat that stuff. But and the whole, 95% of the list are all these processed foods. So then to find quinoa, I've got to dig through all that material to find my stuff. So yeah, a lot of these lists aren't very practical for someone who's really into health, but you can find what you need. I don't really have a great, I'm in the midst of compiling, but the issue is too, different labs come up with different numbers depending on how they measure the glycemic index in the food, and so you have all these discrepancies with different lists. So
And one question on the water again. What's the source of the glass containers again?
custompure.com.
Custom.
Yeah, you can order these online and you get 5 gallon, which is really heavy by the way. When it's full of water, you're talking 55 pounds, and 3 gallon, which is much more manageable when it's full of water. So, and I like to use glass because plastic leaches endocrine disruptors into the water, and so you're drinking estrogen water. Being a guy, I'm not really into drinking estrogen water. And even as a woman, with all the cancer issues that are happening, it's not a good idea to drink estrogen water.
And what about metal containers?
Metal is certainly better than plastic, but you're still going to leach some things in from even these stainless steel containers. So I like glass. I'm a glass fan, which means I carry around my little mason jar with the non-GMO lid, because these guys with the white material, that's BPA stuff. And so this is just metal, so I don't allow each and any of that into my water. And you can buy glass containers, that look a lot prettier than this. More aesthetics than I am, so.
You just don't want to turn that one upside down.
Yeah,
On the
exactly.
side, yeah.
Totally. So. Yeah.
So once you take this healthier approach, when could you expect to see a response in your body, like when you won't have the effects? I've got acid reflux for years. When first I cut out gluten, now I just recently tried to cut out sugar because I noticed every time I ate anything with sugar in it, I got indigestion, and so.
Great question.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what.
The reason I really like that question is because it really leads me into something that I really should have mentioned in this talk. And so the first to answer your question directly, it's going to be different with different people. It depends on where you're starting.
Okay.
And it depends on how motivated you are and how much compliance you have with the healthier approach.
Okay.
How many times you fall off the wagon, all that plays in. So it's going to be different for different people. If you're traveling down this path, definitely encourage you to work with someone who can support you and help keep you motivated on the path. And also, it doesn't matter, a lot of people when they try to get healthy, they're like, okay, well, what do I eat? What do I eat? How do I change my diet? But one thing that they're missing is digestion. Because it doesn't matter what you're eating, if you're not digesting well, you're not going to get much benefit.
Right.
So oftentimes the first place to start is with your GI tract, because so many of us have GI tracts that are completely out of balance and out of whack. So that's the place to start. You start working on supporting your digestive health and rebuilding the garden, which is your digestion, and tending that garden very carefully. And as you rebuild the health of that garden and that comes back online, then as you start to improve the diet, you're going to see big results. Because now you're going to be able to be absorbing all this phenomenal nutrition that's coming in from these great healthy foods that you're consuming. Whereas if you just try to go healthy with your diet but didn't prepare your digestion, well, you wouldn't get a whole lot of benefit out of it. You might get discouraged. You might get a lot of side effects because you're eliminating something you think is unhealthy and adding in something that you're sensitive to. And you're getting all these reactions and you don't know why. So it can be a little tricky.
Do that? I mean, I guess that's my question. How do you build that foundation?
That's a
before you
big
go?
topic. I mean, I do 3-hour classes on that topic that just scratch the surface. So yeah, I mean, definitely come see me.
Okay.
Digestive enzymes, probiotics, hydrochloric acid. You've got to rebuild your mucus lining in your gut, in your stomach, heal leaky gut. There's a fair amount to it.
Okay.
So,
All right. Thank you.
yeah.
So in other words, I'm not going to start losing weight tomorrow.
Yeah, well, it could be a
Because
process.
everything that I have ever known, it's just been...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I ruined your Thursday night.
And the stuff that I thought I'd learned recently and could handle, oops, there's 2 more paragraphs that I didn't know affected that.
Well, be gentle on yourself.
It is.
Be gentle on yourself and baby step your way. So if you're eating glutinous grains and you just learned that gluten's not the best thing in the world, then switch to sprouted gluten, sprouted grains. And that's an upgrade. You're moving in the right direction. Don't try to go from eating a ton of wheat and oats to no grains at all, like cold turkey. Maybe you have a personality that can pull that off, and if so, awesome. But for most of us, we have to baby step our way. So it's you pick a manageable chunk that you know you can accomplish. And one of the things I really like to do is support people in figuring out, partnering with them to figure out what that manageable chunk is that we can work on over the next 2 weeks, and then send them home with the what to work on, and then 2 weeks come back, and then we come up with the next manageable chunk. And so that way we baby step our way. So each step doesn't feel like a huge stretch. And it's a more comfortable process. And you do a year of that, where you make a few tweaks for a couple weeks, and then another few tweaks. A year later, you're in a whole different place. But it wasn't a real incredibly challenging journey to get there. It was a relatively comfortable journey because you took these small steps that you were able to do, so you feel successful. So it's a little tricky. There's a lot more to improving your diet than just improving your diet. You got to work with the emotional eating aspect and all the different psychologies that come into play with food around humans. So it's big. It's a big thing to shift and get healthy. So be gentle on yourself. Give yourself a hug. Give yourself a hug for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard you were gonna sponsor a community cleanse in the spring.
That's actually David Lerner, our
Oh,
acupuncturist here
David,
at
I
the
know
clinic.
David, yeah.
And David's awesome, and the cleanse that he's going to be doing is a great cleanse. So this is a great way for you guys to participate in the spring cleanse.
Okay.
And we're going to, a lot of us as practitioners are going to be doing it. It's going to be a community cleanse.
That's a great idea.
So we're excited about it.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right.
Thanks for coming,
Thank
guys.
you.